All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're going to try and decode one of the most important and honestly, most complicated geopolitical events of our time, the war between Russia and Ukraine. The goal here is to get past the headlines and get right to the heart of its deep and tangled roots. So, February 2022, it's a date we all remember, right? That's when the full-scale invasion kicked off. But the biggest question, the one that really matters, is why? I mean, how did we get here? To answer that, believe me, we need to rewind the clock way, way before 2022.
So, where do we even begin? Well, we're going to start by peeling back the first layer. You see, the roots of this conflict, they aren't new at all. They're actually buried deep in the last 30 years of history, going all the way back to the moment the Soviet Union fell apart. Okay, so picture this. It's 1991, the Soviet Union collapses, and boom, an independent Ukraine is on the map. Now, for many, this was a moment of celebration, but from Moscow's point of view, it was a huge geopolitical hit. For a long, long time, Russia had seen Ukraine as this vital piece of its strategic buffer zone. Think of it like a protective shield, separating it from potential rivals in the West. This wasn't just about land, it was about the very foundation of its national security.
All right, so we've got the historical setup, right? Russia sees Ukraine as this critical buffer. But what was the actual spark? What was the one thing that really lit the fuse on all this tension? Well, the answer is probably one of the biggest, most debated topics in Europe since the Cold War ended. And this is where things get really complicated, because you have two completely opposing viewpoints that just can't coexist. From Russia's side, NATO expanding eastward isn't just a political move, it's a direct threat to their security. I mean, imagine the world's most powerful military alliance setting up shop right on your border. For them, Ukraine joining NATO was the absolute red line. But then, you flip the coin. From NATO's perspective, it's pretty simple. We're a defensive alliance, and every independent country has the right to decide its own future. You can see how there's just no middle ground here. They're on a collision course.
And here's another layer to add to the mix. While all this external pressure was building up, you had these cracks forming inside Ukraine itself. The country was, and still is, culturally divided. You've got the western parts looking toward Europe, and the eastern parts with really strong historical and cultural ties to Russia. And these internal divisions, they were about to become incredibly important.
So, for years, all of this was just bubbling under the surface, right? A lot of political tension, but no open conflict. And then, 2014 happened. This was the turning point. This was the year everything exploded, and the fight went from words to weapons. And man, when it happened fast. Just look at this timeline. At the start of the year, you have the Maidan protests, which force out the pro-Russian government. Russia's response is swift. By March, they've annexed Crimea. And just a month later, in April, a hot war breaks out in the Donbass. In just a few months, the entire game had changed. Now, people did try to stop the fighting. You had the Minsk agreements, for example. But they just didn't work. And this quote really nails why. There was zero trust between the two sides, and their long-term goals were completely at odds. So nobody really followed through on the agreements. The fighting in Donbass just got locked in place, and you could feel that something much, much bigger was on the horizon. Okay, so now let's pull the camera back a bit. Let's look at the bigger picture. Because you have to understand, this was never just about Russia and Ukraine. It's really a major front in a much larger geopolitical chess match between Russia and the West. And Ukraine, well, it became the board. And to really get what's going on, you need to know this term, proxy war. It sounds complicated, but it's simple. It's when big powers, instead of fighting each other directly, which would be catastrophic, they fight through other countries. They back different sides in a local conflict. And that is a perfect description of what's happening in Ukraine. So what's the motivation for these big powers? Well, for the West, it's about helping Ukraine, for sure. But it's also about strategically containing and weakening Russia. For Russia, this isn't just some foreign conflict. They see it as a fight for their very survival, for their security, and for their place as a major player on the world stage. And this is why this war matters to absolutely everyone, no matter where you live. Its effects ripple out across the entire globe. Think about it. It's caused massive energy and food crises, totally messed up global supply chains. It's basically forcing us all to reconsider how the world even works. Let's make this super real for a second. Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of the world, right? Well, when the war shut down its ports, all that grain stopped moving. What happens? Food prices everywhere go through the roof. At the same time, you have sanctions on Russian oil and gas, so energy prices soar.
This 1-2 punch sent a shockwave across the global economy, and it's the developing countries that got hit the absolute hardest. Okay, so that's how we got here. The big question now is, what happens next? Where is all of this headed? Let's break down some of the most likely scenarios. Most experts see this playing out in one of three ways. First, and what many think is most likely, is that this just drags on, a long, grinding war where neither side can really win. The second possibility is some kind of negotiated ceasefire. The fighting stops, but it freezes the conflict in place without solving any of the deep-seated problems. And the third option, the scariest one, is a major escalation, one that could pull the big powers into a direct fight. That's the least likely, thankfully, but it's still a risk. So what's the big takeaway here? It's that this isn't a simple problem with a simple solution. This war is the result of decades of history, politics, and security fears, all tangled together. You can't just solve something like this with guns and tanks alone. In the end, what happens next is going to depend on a whole mix of things. What actually happens on the ground, how much political will there is on both sides to keep fighting or to make peace, and, of course, what the big global powers decide to do. The honest truth is, nobody knows for sure. And that brings us to the final and maybe most important question. Because no matter how this particular war ends, it has already changed the world. So the question we're all left with is, what does the new world order look like after this? How is everything going to be different?